Hi there, welcome to Emotionally Healthy Spirituality Session 3. This is a course I'm doing. I'm running it in person at Christian Life Church every 3 weeks on a Monday evening, and then recording it for those who can't make it. It is a course heavily based on Pete Scazzaro's fantastic book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. So heavily based on that. I just wanted to kind of give my own take on his excellent material. So a massive shout out to him. Most of it's his material. I've kind of added some bits in and swapped it around a little bit and tried to make some flavour of it for us, which hopefully you are enjoying. I am loving it. I've read the book a few times. When you kind of prepare it and then teach it and then teach it again, it really kind of sinks into you, and I am loving some of the things I am becoming aware of, seeing as we do it. Hope you are too. Session 3 is all about the need to look backwards in order to look forwards. The reality is that we have been birthed into a particular family, in a particular place, at a particular moment in history. And that reality granted us certain privileges, certain gifts. It also granted us certain things that were not gifts, what we might call emotional baggage that we carried from being born and living in that family, at that place, at that time. Perhaps some of us feel like we are just kind of pulling a suitcase along. Some of us feel like we have like a whole HGV trailer behind us of pain and wounds and bad experiences from our past. Whether we feel it's big or little, in one sense, the key is not how much we feel we've got. I would suggest, as we'll go through this, I'm going to show you, or hopefully help you, we all have it. So we all have things that we've brought in that are not healthy and helpful. And more than that, it has a big impact on our lives. Because our past experiences create lenses or filters for us to see the world through, which means our past has a huge impact on how we interpret the present. And interpret, I think, is a good word, because none of us experience reality. And remember, God is ultimate reality. So reality is how we interact, what we see, what we experience. But God is ultimate reality as well. So it affects everything. Our past, we experience everything in the present through the lens of the past. We interpret everything we experience today, whether that be positive or negative, through the lens of our past. And so it's absolutely key, if we're going to be emotionally and spiritually healthy, that we understand what those lenses are. What are the ways we interpret today based on what the past was? And is that healthy? Is it something we want to continue? Is it something we're happy with? Or is it just followed us our whole lives and we're not even aware of it? When I did this in person, we started with an icebreaker question. And the question was, what does the word family mean to you? And I've taken all those flip charts and put them on this kind of graphic. As you can see, and there were maybe only 7 or 8 people in the room when I shared it in person. But just from those few people, wow, what a big topic. Wow, what a big kind of sense of, wow, there's a lot going on here. And I'm sure you can relate to some of the words on the screen there. Maybe there's some ones you want to add on. But what it shows me is that just that word, that sense of family, is very loaded and can mean all sorts of things to all sorts of different people. So we're going to explore that thought about family and explore the biblical view of family and some of the things that we can see about family, both positive and negative, from scripture later on. But before we explore that, I want to talk about nature versus nurture. Now, I'm sure you are aware of the nature versus nurture debate and this core message that human behaviour and development is shaped by both inherited biological factors, so the genes that are passed on from your mum and your dad, and environmental experiences. And for many years it was like, is it nurture? Is it nurture? Now the vast majority of psychologists have come to agree that it's not nature versus nurture, but nature and nurture. It's both and. And so nature is about the biological and genetic factors we are born with, such as inherited traits, genetic risk factors, physical appearances. Nurture is about the environmental influences that shape us. So the family we're born into, the culture of that family, how love was or not expressed in that family, education, culture, early experiences, lifestyle, that's all nurture. And some traits are strongly biological, so the colour of your eyes, just wherever you live in the world, the type of kind of place you're going does not affect your eye colour. That is pretty much determined, almost 100%, I believe, by the genetic code that's passed on from mum and from dad. But some things are more clearly driven by experience, such as manners, attitudes, learned behaviours. And as I say, the agreement now is that both the genetic DNA you are born with and the environment you are brought up with come together, and out of those two things, that affects how we are. But the fascinating thing is that a person may inherit a potential or a predisposition, but the environment can affect whether and how that potential develops. So you may have a child who, in their DNA, have incredible musical ability. But if they are brought up in a family where musicality is not valued, not expressed, and not kind of encouraged, that part of them may never develop, or is unlikely definitely to lead to its full potential. At the same time, you could have somebody who has very little musical DNA but grows up in a very musical family, and they can thrive musically. Such is the power of the two. We talked about this a little bit, about how our genes are expressed and how our DNA can actually change by our experiences, and we're going to look at that a bit more now. And one of the ways that studies do this to work out nature and nurture is to study twins who have been separated at birth and brought up in different environments. So genetically they're exactly the same, but their environments are different. And what we see, for example, height, a child can inherit genes for tallness, but if they live in an environment of poor nutrition and illness, they may not grow as tall as their genes would determine in a different environment. I've already talked about musical ability. Behaviour, children can learn politeness, aggression or social habits by observing and receiving reinforcement. Somebody may be genetically quite passive, but depending on the environment they grow up in, they may become more passive or may go the other way. Some genes can increase risk for some conditions, some mental health conditions. So some people just genetically can be more prone to experience certain mental health conditions. But at the same time, trauma, stress, relationships and life experiences also play a major role. I'm going to show you a video now on epigenetics, which we talked about a little bit in session 2, and this whole idea of nature versus nurture.
Meet Lucky Lyle and Trouble Tim. Now you might think they look a lot alike. That's because they're identical twins. But imagine them being raised in completely different environments. As adults, they turn out very differently. Lucky Lyle is a model citizen. He goes to work, pays his taxes, treats others well, and gets an education. Trouble Tim is on a different path. He robs banks, doesn't pay taxes, and gets his first prison sentence at the same time as Lyle gets his diploma. Their genes are identical, so it must be their separate environments that have made them so different, right? Well, there's more to it than that. Much more. We need to rewind a bit in time. You see, one of the great questions of humanity is, what makes us us? Early explanations had a hint of the supernatural about them. As the centuries whizzed by, science emerged and fought a tough battle to gain credibility. Eventually, social science emerged with the popular theory that our environment is what makes us us. Let's call this nurture. Undaunted, the biological sciences presented another theory: genes, an unchangeable blueprint in you from birth, decides everything. Let's call this one nature. So, are we a product of our genes or of our environment? The battle raged on. Observations in a newer field of study suggest that both are partly right. This field is called epigenetics. It means above genetics and has to do with how nature and nurture interact. At the heart of this discussion is one simple question asked by researcher Michael Meany: what makes a good rat mama? Well, for a rat mother, nothing says love and care like some nice, vigorous licking. The higher the number of licks, the more love and the better the mama. With this in mind, the researchers compared two groups of rat mothers, one that licked their babies a lot and another that didn't. They found that when babies grew up, they carried their mama's behavior with them and passed it on to the next generation and the next one, and so on. But could it simply be that this particular group of rats was genetically predisposed to produce caring mothers? Well, to test this, the researchers took newborn babies from low-licking mothers and fostered them with high-licking mothers and vice versa. It turns out that if the mother is a high licker, the rat baby becomes a high licker too, regardless of whether it's genetically related to her or not. So genes really don't have anything to do with it then? In true scientific fashion, the researchers dove right into the brains of these rats to see what, if anything, was different in the brains of the babies of high-licking versus low-licking mothers. When they looked at genes that possibly play a role in motherly care, they found crucial differences. Newborn rat babies have clusters of molecules called methyl groups attached to these genes. These methyl groups silence the gene, effectively switching it off. The researchers discovered that while the methyl groups in rats from low-licking mothers were still attached, in the rats from high-licking mothers, these methyl groups had disappeared. This was also true for the rats that had been adopted by high-licking rat mothers. The care these rats received from their mothers actually physically altered their genetic expression. Now that's all fine and good for rats, but what about people? Well, the same is true for Lucky Lyle and Troubled Tim, and for you and me. The genes you're born with are the genes you've got. But lifestyle and environmental influences such as nutrition, exercise, smoking, stress, and love greatly affect your biology. These changes can actually be observed at the DNA level. The bright side is that epigenetic changes happen throughout our lives, and our choices can make real differences in how we develop as human beings.
I love that video, because I just love those drawn videos. I think they're amazing, and I'm a geek, so I love learning about that sort of stuff. But one of the things I find fascinating is that no matter our genes, our environment can cause us to be different. Did you pick up there that in terms of the rats, the low-licking rats, so that they're genetically, they had something switched off or on, whichever way around it was, that meant they did not give affection. But then they get put with a mother who is affectionate, and she expresses that affection, and their DNA changes and means they become an affectionate person. Just think about that in terms of generational transfer, in terms of generational change. Think of that in terms of what can happen just psychologically. We've not even added the power of the Holy Spirit and Jesus into it yet. Just from a pure psychological and neurological place, transformation can happen. Generational patterns can be affected. And now remember that we know Jesus, and we know the power of the Holy Spirit. We know the power of inner healing. We know the power of spirit to change things. We know the power of forgiveness from past generations. This is why this is so exciting, because what it shows you is no matter your background, no matter what's going on, no matter where you've come from, transformation is possible biologically, neurologically, even at the level of your DNA, and by the power of the Spirit. There is hope. No matter where you find yourself, no matter your past, no matter where you find yourself in your presence, no matter your family of origin, there is a different future for you that can be taken. Because psychologically I believe that, but as a lover of Jesus, I also believe that the power to change can be supercharged when you add in the Holy Spirit and the love of a community, trying to outwork the words of a family together. Okay, let's move on from nature and nurture to talk about biblical family. One of the things that I find interesting when we think about family, and again we had this conversation when we were in person, was what do we think of when we think of family? And I was trying to point out that as Westerners, particularly, because it's not true all over the world, and as Western Christians or people of no faith even, our concept of family is very small. kind of classic 2.4 children, mum, dad, like that's our classic view of family. But actually, that idea to the whole of Scripture from beginning to end is not there. There's no concept of kind of a nuclear family, I think is what we'd call it, this small concept, because for the Bible times, the concept written, it's about an extended family. It would refer to your extended family over 3 or 4 generations, and we'll explore, if you know Scripture, you'll know that phrase occurs quite a lot, 3 or 4 generations, both in blessings and curses it comes up, and we're going to explore why that might be. But in terms of 4 generations, that means going back to my great-grandparents. So that's me, I was born in 1977, my parents, who were born in the early 50s, my grandparents, who have both passed away now, but even if they had my mum and dad when in their 20s, I mean, to be born in the 30s, 1930s. So if we go back another 20 years, my great-grandparents, that means they'd be born in the 1910s. So right now, my family to the 3rd and 4th generation covers easily over 100 years. 4 generations, easily that can cover over 100 years. And when the Bible talks about family, that's what it's talking about. It's not talking about your brother and your mum and your dad. It's talking about your extended family going back 3 or 4 generations, going back 100 years. It's all the brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts and significant others going back all that time. I don't know about you, but we had uncles and aunts in my family that were not uncles and aunts. It was like my dad's best man at his wedding and my mum's best friend, and he was an uncle and she was an aunt. And so it's like all those people as well. This is a big group of people that when the Bible thinks about family, that's what it's talking about. And whilst we're affected by external events and circumstances, our families are the most powerful group to which we will ever belong, regardless of whether we're in amongst them, as it were, or whether we move to the other side of the world. The history of our family silently follows us wherever we go. And again, it's interesting that numerous times we find those words, as I've said, to the 3rd and 4th generation. Exodus 20, Exodus 34, 2 Samuel 2. It seems that there's this sense that the actions of one generation flow down to the 3rd and 4th generation. And it made me think of those words in Jesus in a new light in Matthew 10. Whoever loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. If you think of this of clinging onto a culture of your family, of loving their way of living more than Jesus' way of living, or of assuming your family, the way your family lives is the right way to live, perhaps these words could be interpreted differently. And we see the handing down of culture and ways of living by exploring the lives of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. This is fascinating. See, Genesis relates how the truth that sins and blessings are passed from generation to generation. And on one level, Abraham, this is all in Genesis, because of his obedience, he got passed from generation to generation to his children, Isaac, his grandchildren, Jacob, and his great-grandchildren, Joseph and their brothers. But at the same time, as those blessings flowing down the line, we also observe a pattern of brokenness and emotional and spiritual unhealth getting passed through the generations. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, through all these generations, there's a pattern of lying. Abraham lies twice about Sarah, denies being a husband, and he's happy for somebody else to take her as their husband just to save his own skin. Abraham lies twice. Isaac and Rebekah's marriage is characterized by lies. Jacob lies to everybody. I mean, his name means deceiver. And 10 of Jacob's children lied about Joseph's death, faking a funeral and keeping a family secret for more than 10 years. There's this just pattern of lying. Or take favoritism by at least one parent. Abraham favours Ishmael. Isaac favours Esau. Jacob favours Joseph and later Benjamin. There's this pattern of favoritism that runs from generation to generation. Brothers experiencing a cut-off from one another in each generation. Isaac and Ishmael are cut off from one another. Jacob flees from Esau and gets cut off. Joseph becomes cut off from his brothers for more than a decade. There's also poor intimacy in the marriage of each generation. Abraham has a child out of wedlock because with Hagar. Isaac has a terrible relationship with Rebekah, and Jacob had 2 wives and 2 concubines. It's fascinating to see how these traits, this trait of lying, this trait of favoritism, this trait of separation, this trait of poor intimacy just gets passed on from one generation to another. And of course it would, because it's been modelled. Why would Joseph's brothers know any different? They've seen dad and granddad and great-granddad offer all this favouritism. They've seen dad and granddad and great-granddad lie. That's how you get by. That's how life happens. That's how it all works. They've had no other model. I'm not blaming anybody here because all they are doing is modelling what they've seen their parents do. But in modelling it, they perpetuate the emotional and spiritual unhealthiness, and it just keeps going down the line. Which is why taking time to be aware of those things is so helpful, because you have the opportunity to stop that generational brokenness. But you have to become aware of it first. You have to first spend some time working out what are the ways that are unhealthy, that I've lived with my whole life because this is how we do family. But actually, is that emotionally healthy? Is it spiritually healthy? How does that work? You see, many of us don't realise it, but we've come from a culture. We've come from a familial culture that when we were children, we had no idea of it. We just swam in it because you just get brought up in it and this is how it is. But in truth, what happens is each family has its own set of, well, you could call them commandments really. Pete in the book calls them the 10 commandments of family. And we often underestimate the deep conscious imprint our family of origin leaves in us. And it's often only as we grow older that we realise just how deep that influence runs. But each of us has been imprinted with certain ways of thinking and behaving. And our culture, the media, the events of our lives have also imprinted on us. But those behavioural patterns operate under a set of commandments. Some spoken and explicit, more often though they are unspoken and implicit, hardwired into our brains and in some cases our DNA. Wonder what the 10 commandments of your family might be across various different areas. Maybe in terms of money, maybe you got told money is the best source of security. Maybe you've got to make lots of it, so you've made it. In terms of sex, maybe sex was not to be spoken about openly. Maybe maybe you were told that it's fine for men to sleep around, but women have to be chaste. Maybe you were told that, I don't know what messages you received about that. But there'll be messages you've received about all these different areas, about conflict, about expressing anger, about relationships, about different cultures, about success, about feeling emotions. That's a massive one. Handling grief and loss, massive one. Handling conflict, massive one. And what's fantastic, not fantastic, but what's interesting to me is that you see this most. Faye and I have done a lot of kind of marriage prep with couples over the years. I don't know how many times we've done it now, a lot. But each time you get this fascinating thing where they have these conversations, these couples who have come from different cultures, and each is like, that's really weird. And the other person's going, no, what you do is really weird. And it's like this clash of cultures, and that's one of the reasons why marriage is so hard, because it is a culture clash often. Things are coming together that you have lived with and thought were perfectly normal and perfectly right, and somebody else goes, that's weird. You don't do it like that. That's not right. That's not how it should happen. And it's like, you've never thought about it. You've never challenged it. You've never considered it could be different. It's also why marriage can be wonderful, because it causes you to question all sorts of things and hopefully work out what culture you want to create in your marriage if you are in that place. But they're all those areas that I talked about before. I know there's parenting, gender roles, singleness, physical affection. These are like, this is what the culture of our family was. It's interesting to think about what would be the 10 commandments of your family. Like, what would be the things that what were the key messages that got brought down that your family were like, this is really important. These are the values of our family. Pete, in his book, points out that often when somebody thinks about their family and thinks about their background and the 10 commandments, if you like, they'll say things like, well, I think my family's really messed up. And his response that he puts in the book, which I think is really helpful for all of us, is this. This is what he writes. All families are broken and fallen. None of us comes from perfect families with perfect parents. Most parents did the best they could with what they brought with them into adulthood. And it's likely some of the things that did hurt us, such as criticism and rejection, were a result of what was handed to them by their families of origin, rather than a reflection on us or their love for us. Our fear of bringing secrets and sin to the light, however, drives many people away, to prefer the illusion that if they don't think about it, it somehow goes away. It doesn't. Unhealed wounds often opens up to habitual sin against God and others. I find his words there about most parents did the best they could with what they brought with them into adulthood very helpful. Many people are angry at their parents if they didn't experience the childhood that they would have hoped for or wanted or longed for. And understandably so. But in the end, people do their best with what they have. And they can only parent with what they know. They cannot parent in ways they do not know. You cannot parent from a place of security if they know no security. You cannot parent from a place of unconditional love if they've never experienced unconditional love. They cannot say sorry if they don't know what it is to be forgiven. And that in no way condones poor parenting, it in no way condones abuse or anything like that. But at the same time, perhaps it might help us have a little bit more grace for those who have gone before us, recognising that we are doing the best we can with what brought us into adulthood, which is exactly what our parents did, which is what their grandparents did, which is what our great-grandparents did. And each generation, hopefully is learning to grow. Hopefully it's learning to do something different. But the truth is that all our families are messed up. And we've all been imprinted with some ways of thinking that are unhelpful. And we all need to look back and explore what are those ways and how can I be healed from them. Let me move on to Joseph. We've already seen how Joseph came from a family with very challenging traits: poor intimacy, lying, deception, separation, favoritism. And yet, Joseph manages to overcome those traits and find a new way of living. And I want to share with you 4 insights that Pete shares in the book about how Joseph might have managed that. Number 1, Joseph had a profound sense of the bigness of God. Repeatedly, Joseph affirms the large loving hand of God through all his pain and hardship. It was not you who sent me here, but God, he repeatedly proclaims to his brothers when they eventually catch up with him in Egypt. Now, that's the rightest understanding of what God's doing. I struggle to recognise that it was God who put him in a pit and left him for dead. He didn't. His brothers did that. And because God is a God who does not control, well, God's not going to stop him. Because God has given control over to humanity. That is what love does. It gives up control to other people. And that then means people get hurt. That's why there's sin in the world. So I don't believe that God sent him in the pit and in the slave. But God's redemptive power is at work despite the sin and pain that other people caused him. God's redemptive power is at work for him. Because no matter the situation, Joseph seems to cling on to the fact that God can still work. He wasn't afraid the situation was bigger than God, or that where he found himself meant God couldn't work. He affirms that God, often mysteriously, does what God does through darkness and obscurity. But he understood that in all things God was at work in spite of, through and against all human effort to bring about his purposes for Joseph and indeed the whole nation. It is, of course, a legitimate question to ask, why did God allow Joseph to go through such pain and loss? All questions are legitimate. Not all questions lead you somewhere helpful. So it's absolutely right to ask, but why did that happen? Why did God let that happen? Why couldn't God just do this? Why couldn't God just do that? But the reality is there isn't an answer to that question. I mean, you can pontificate about it for ages and, spend days talking about it. But in the end, it's just a guess. And in the end, that guess doesn't take you any closer to being emotionally and spiritually healthy. Working out why God didn't do this or that or the other in your own life doesn't lead to discipleship. It doesn't lead to being like Jesus. It doesn't lead to healing either. What does lead to healing, and what I am more concerned about, is how do we find life now? What does it mean like now? What does it mean I live now? Where do I need to extend forgiveness? Where do I need to extend grace? Who do I need to get with in order to find healing? And much more important questions. And questions that will take you to somewhere rather than leave you stuck pondering about the past with an absolute guarantee that you're not going to know the answer to that question this side of heaven anyway. Joseph rested in God's goodness and love, even when the circumstances went from bad to worse. Number 2, Joseph admitted honestly the sadness and losses of his family. Many of us are resistant to going back and feeling the hurt and pain of our past. It can feel like a black hole or an abyss that might swallow us up, and we wonder if it's only going to get worse. Interestingly, that's often what happens. It gets worse. Or it feels that way. Whenever we start to explore this stuff, whenever we start to explore our past and our pain and our hurts, maybe through counselling or therapy or just talking with a trusted friend, it feels worse before it gets better. At least that's my experience and the experience of everyone I've talked to who's gone through that process. It's not actually worse because nothing's changed. It's all past. But when we start to explore it and look into it and look inside ourselves, we realise, oh, that's there. Because it gets worse because we've often not allowed ourselves to feel the pain before. We've not faced up to it and accepted it. That's what puts many people off dealing with their past. But what people forget is their past is already dealing with them and causing them pain. They're just not aware of it. So when you go through any form of exploring your past at whatever level, suddenly you may well become aware of something that is painful. Well, it's always been there. It didn't just appear when you started thinking about it. It's always been there and it's always been painful. You just numbed it and chose not to be aware of it because you shoved it in a cupboard in your heart somewhere. But actually life comes from opening that cupboard and being aware of it. This is the whole point of, well, there's lots of points to the story of Lazarus, but one of the points of the story of Lazarus is, roll back the stone. What's the response? It's going to stink. Yeah, death stinks. It's horrible. But if you don't roll back the stone and bear the stench of death, you can't see resurrection. And this is why many people are never transformed, because they want resurrection without being willing to face up to the stench of death. They're not willing for the stench of death. They don't want to feel it. They don't want to know about it. So they try and find resurrection every other way, but in the way of Jesus. In the way of Jesus, resurrection comes after death. After death. You've got to die first before you can experience new life. You've got to experience the reality of death before you can experience new life. Number 3, Joseph rewrote his life script according to Scripture. Joseph had plenty of reason to say to himself, well, I don't have a right to exist, or I'm a mistake, or nobody cares, or I should never trust anybody, I shouldn't take risks, it's too painful. As many, if not all of us, could do. But Joseph didn't. You see, our families and traumatic events in our histories often hand us negative messages or scripts that unconsciously direct our lives, and the decisions we make often forgotten are replayed over and over in adult situations because without knowing it, we're operating from a script that got handed down to us about how to be. But that script may not be emotionally healthy. It may not be spiritually healthy. It may not be how Jesus would act. But if we don't explore the script we've been given, we can't change it. You have to look back first to know, what am I doing that is not right? And then you can look to Jesus to work out what is right. But you have to do both. You can't just look across to Jesus and go, that's what's right, because you have to unlearn something before you can learn it. And most people never think to unlearn things. They just try and learn things on top of things, and it never works. Because these are ways of behavior and these are habits. This is a culture you're living out. So just working out what Jesus says and trying to do that doesn't work. We have to unpick the old wrong habits first and then go in a new direction. Number 4, Joseph partnered with God to be a blessing. He could have destroyed his brothers with anger, but he chose to bless them. And for those of us that have been deeply wounded like Joseph, that can feel difficult, almost impossible. But Joseph made a choice. He asked questions perhaps every day like, is God safe? Is God good? Can God be trusted? And they're huge questions that take a lifetime. I don't think we ever answer them. The yes becomes more regular than the no, I think, is probably the journey of faith. But I think Joseph had developed a secret history over a long period of time in his relationship with God, which meant when the crunch and the big decisions came about, do I bless? What do I do with my brothers who threw me in a pit? all the small choices up to that point meant he could bless and he could bring some wonderful things for the whole land. And we'll talk in further sessions about the need for small daily choices that when you get to the big decisions, make it much easier to make emotionally and spiritually healthy ones. Okay, 2 things before we finish. 1, a community of solitudes, and 2, an exercise. A community of solitudes then. A gravitational pull back to the destructive patterns of our family of origin and our culture is enormous. And going back to go forward is something we must do in the context of community. With mature friends, mentors, for some the help of a spiritual director or counsellor or therapist. We need trusted people in our lives, of whom we can ask questions like, how do you experience me? Tell me the feelings and thoughts you have when you're with me. What vibe do you pick up when I'm around? Brilliant questions. But of course, you have to be courageous to ask them. But if you can be that courageous, and if you can prayerfully listen to those answers, whilst having some self-compassion like we talked about in session 1, then that will go a long way toward getting healing and a perspective on those areas of our lives that we need to change. Both Henri Nouwen and Thomas Merton, incredible authors, said we need to be part of something called a community of solitudes. What they meant is that community only really exists when those people in community have learned to embrace solitude, which is one of the, I think, key disciplines to be able to live an emotionally healthy life. Nouwen said this: solitude is where we listen to God. It's remarkable that solitude always calls us to community. In solitude, you realise you're part of a human family and that you want to live something together. By community, I don't mean formal communities, I mean families, friends, parishes, prayer groups. Community is not an organisation. Community is a way of living. You gather around people with whom you want to proclaim the truth that we are all divine. Community is not easy. Somebody once said community is the place where the person you least want to live with always lives. Why is it so important that solitude come before community? If we do not know we are the beloved sons and daughters of God, we're going to expect someone in the community to make us feel that way, and they cannot. We'll expect someone to give us that perfect, unconditional love, which they cannot. Because community is not loneliness grabbing onto loneliness. I'm so lonely and you're so lonely, let's try and deal with that loneliness together. True community is solitude grabbing onto solitude. I am the beloved, you are the beloved, and together we can build a whole. Perhaps real community can only be created when people come together who are each aware of their belovedness from God and bring that belovedness from the table. That's an equal table. An unequal table is where a situation is created for all sorts of reasons, where people are looking to another person to give them that only God can. But real community is created when people come to a table knowing they are the beloved. And one of the ways we do that, in fact one of the primary ways we do that, is by spending time in solitude. I want to encourage you to apply the things we've been talking about. One of the exercises that Pete recommends is to ponder on the messages we receive from our parents or carers, and to list basically kind of messages from dad or a caregiver, and from mum or a caregiver, and any what he calls earthquake events or major events, and then work out what was the message, what are the core messages I got from these two people and what things happened, and then what was the result of that, because that is effectively your culture. So messages received from our parents might be education is everything, you must achieve to be loved, don't show weakness, always be nice, bury your feelings, don't talk about loss, deal with challenge by avoidance, whether that be drink or drugs or shopping or reading Christian books. They're all forms of avoidance from dealing with reality, or can be. Then we list earthquake events, major events that have shaped us, betrayals, abuse, sudden loss, shameful secrets, divorce, those things that just sent an absolute shockwave through our family. And then we try and review them and try and summarize some of the things we've internalized or normalized. And then the exciting part is when you measure that up to the messages that reflect the family of Jesus. That it's good you exist, that you are deeply lovable, that you are good enough, that you have nothing left to prove, that your needs are valid and a delight, and that you are allowed to make mistakes. I want to encourage you to think on and ponder that. That won't be a quick exercise. It may be something you have to come back to. It may be something you have to ask siblings about, or partners about, or others who know your family. But I would encourage you, have a think. What is the culture you inherited? What are the ways of thinking and living that you just see all through your family? And are they healthy? Emotionally? Spiritually? Would Jesus live like that? They're all brilliant questions to answer. Listen, thank you so much for taking the time to watch. I hope it's been helpful. I hope it's caused you to think and ponder. And session 4, which is all about the wall, is our next session that will be online in about 3 weeks' time. And this is all about the sense that in every Christian's walk, there is a place you hit where it feels like you're not going anywhere. It feels like God's disappeared. It feels like you can't hear him. It feels like you can't sense him. And that is normal. Lots of people get to that point, they think something wrong, they've done something wrong, God's upset with them. As I'll show you, from the incredible material that Pete's written, that's just a normal part of the Christian life, and learning to go through that wall is a key part in becoming emotionally and spiritually healthy. Till next time, lots of love.